Anyway, while we're waiting on that, I'll give you guys a little bit of a background on Carl and also give you a little bit of a background on the top of the hour ad break, which is coming right now. If you no longer want to see those ads, all you need to do is subscribe for $5 or for free. Here's the 3-minute ad break now. Okay, that's number one. Number two, Carl Beijer is a Jacobin mag writer. Okay, he lived in Ukraine for a couple years. And I would say that he has he works for the People's Policy Project, the think tank, a crowdfunded think tank, and writes for Jacobin magazine. And I think that he has a very interesting take on Ukraine in general as someone who's lived there. And I've been meaning to have him on to discuss for a minute now. Can you hear me, Carl? Discord reads like you're speaking. You have a green circle around you, but I can't hear you at all. So maybe you lowered the gain a little too much potentially. I don't know. I can't hear you at all now. Hello? Oh, I hear you breathing. I think I just heard you breathe.
Hello, hello.
Wait.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Oh, okay. This is a little bit better. Can you hear me now? Oh, you're still deafened. Okay. Jacobin subscriber here. They do fantastic work. Says paleontologizing. That's a sick name. Paleo salute. Paleontologizing. I assumed that you were a paleontologist. I dig dinosaurs. I assumed that you do that. It would be an odd name to have if you didn't do that. That's sick. That's cool as hell. I love Twitch channels that have like unique interests like that or unique work like that. Stop hiding Godzilla. Oh shit. Don't get the Godzilla truthers started in here, dude. Uh-oh. Chris Pratt is mid and homophobic, and I'm tired of pretending like he's not. That's cool. I don't know where that came from, but okay. I just log on the phone and call in that way, in my opinion. Probably the best and fastest way to do this. Okay, while he's working on that, I'm going to... Hello, Carl. Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me right now?
Oh, dude, perfect. It worked. There? You fixed it. You fixed it completely. Let's go.
Right before I came on, there's a driver download that just totally messed up my headphones and my headphone mic and everything, and so I think that's what happened.
Okay. Carl, can you give us well, you know, it happens. We're all tech boomers out here. So obviously a lot has occurred in the time frame where I asked you to come on, especially for like Russian politics, I guess, which we can touch on, as well as we were just watching Joe Brandon talk about how Alexei Navalny's death is a result of Putin and his thugs, he said, taking a strong stance against Vladimir Putin. And I don't know if you like looked at all of the Hasan Ukraine takes that was swirling around as I asked you to like go through them a little bit. Maybe you didn't, maybe you did. I don't know. We can go through them as well.
Yeah, I looked through it a bit and looked at some of the responses and that kind of thing. So I have a general idea, I think, of what's going on.
So you are. Do you mind giving a little bit of your background to those in the audience that might not be familiar with your work? Because I feel like while you are also a dirty little lefty, I feel like your opinion on Ukraine is shaped by your experience with Ukraine. You lived there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You lived there for
Yeah, I lived I lived there between 2017 and about 2018. And I was just teaching there. I went out there to teach English. I've also lived in Russia. Lived in Moscow for a little bit. Um, and besides that, I have some academic background in Russia. I'm a member of the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. Um, this is, I would say, this is kind of like my geopolitical field, or as close as it comes. But yeah, I've been to both countries and been sort of all over Ukraine, traveled all over the place, and feel like I have a pretty good handle on what's going on there.
Okay, perfect. On that note, I think that there was I feel like in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there were a
Yeah,
lot of people who took L's, myself included, in terms of like reading the situation and thinking that I had this like famous tweet that everybody keeps always bringing up, where I said that Putin is a bad person and not a mad person, and that
yeah,
he would never be able to permanently annex a country with 44 million people that has a national project of like being not a part of Russia, which is albeit reductive terms, but I think that I still stand by the second part of that. But
yeah,
this was the reason why I was very uh, uh, callous in my
yeah,
analysis, alongside many of our friends, our mutuals, like the Chapo boys as well, saying that Russia will never invade Ukraine. You guys are fucking going crazy over that kind of thing. And
yeah,
you had I guess you had a slight difference in perspective
yeah.
at that time, maybe get considering your background, and I wanted to hear, like, I wanted to get started on that part. Like, I
Yeah,
wanted to go all the way back to, I guess, square four. Wouldn't say
yeah,
it's square
yeah.
one, but
Yeah. So, I mean, I think a lot of this relitigation of the invasion and who got it right and who got it wrong was silly because, the fact is, the people who got it right, it's not like they had some kind of access to intelligence of what was actually going on at the battlefront or anything like that. They just believed people who we didn't believe, or who a lot of folks on the left didn't believe.
yeah, like the
So
State
it,
Department.
yeah, and so it's silly to kind of say, well, I guessed right, and sort of position yourself as
Yeah,
having credibility besides that. And I also think that people were very justifiably skeptical of what was going on. The fact is that, yeah, Putin had troops at the border, but they've had troops at the border for since 2014. This has been an ongoing situation, and for most of the time, Putin had not invaded. Um, so I thought that it's always possible that it's going to flare up again. I was out in Kharkiv and I could hear gunshots when I was there, and this was all the way back in like 2018. Um, so it's not like this battle it has just now started. This war has been going on for a long time. But I guess the reason that I got it right was probably just knowing that it was entirely possible. They're already in Donetsk. They're already in Crimea. There's no real reason for him not to. And Putin's game, like he's done the same thing in Georgia, where he sort of tests the boundaries sometimes of what the rest of the world will allow. And historically, he's only sort of gone like an inch at a time forward and then moved back. So I was expecting something more like that. Nobody I know was actually expecting a assault on Kiev. That that is still shocking to
yeah,
me. And I think that people who say that they did expect it are really underappreciating what a crazy move that was.
Yeah.
This is an assault on one of the oldest capitals of Europe. I'm convinced that if it had kept up and if it looked like there was any serious question of Kiev toppling, I don't know that the US would have gotten involved, but I think it's entirely possible that you would have seen a much stronger response coming out of Europe, just because that's a nuts thing to happen.
Yeah.
And is such a gamble. Like, it's such a gamble for Putin to do that. It didn't make sense to me.
Can I
Um,
ask you a question?
yeah. Yeah.
My assessment is even now that I think Putin underestimated the anti-air defenses that Ukraine would have,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that greatly limited its potential air superiority. And
Yeah.
I think that was like a major. I think that was a major issue in like not being able to conduct this, in air quotes, special military operation in the
Yeah.
ways that they thought they could, and now they're in this like weird stalemate in
Yeah.
eastern Ukraine.
I think that's pretty accurate. As I understand it, Putin got some pretty bad intelligence before coming into Ukraine, and that was the big part of it. I think he did, yes, underestimate just the amount of resistance he would meet. I think he also or underestimated how quickly it would come and how quickly Ukraine would sort of get its defense together and be able to put a strong one. Because if I had to guess, I would say that Putin probably was sort of rolling the dice on Kiev, hoping maybe he could get like a quick knockout, kind of cut the snake off at the head type strike. And if he could have done that, it would have been a large victory, but he plainly was not prepared for any kind of siege or anything like that. And that's one of the reasons why he retreated eventually. The Russian army retreated, rather. So yeah, I think that you've got that about right.
Yeah, and then that retreat happened, and then in the process there was also obviously the ceasefire talks that occurred. There was a 15-point plan that
Yeah.
was set forward in Turkey that I thought was like pretty solid overall for all things considered, and how much worse it could have gotten,
Yeah.
and relatively early on as well. And my assessment here was that well, one, I guess like I always said that Crimea was different in comparison to like the 2022 invasion.
Yeah.
It was both different in terms of like military opposition. It was different because of the population size and their like prior Russification initiatives had already made it so that like Crimea was predominantly occupied by people who had, I guess, a connection to Russia. You had Sevastopol, and like the annexation and the way that it was conducted was very different than what is happening right now in eastern Ukraine, right? Obviously, LPR and DPR were accompanied with that, or the interference in LPR and DPR was accompanied with the 2014 actions, right?
Yeah.
And that was an ongoing conflict back and forth, bombing campaigns, and then of course like Russian-backed military routinely fighting. And
Yeah, there's just a big standoff going on,
yeah,
especially in Donetsk forever.
yeah,
Uh, and you could actually, as of 2018, you could actually still go there. It wasn't particularly safe. The city was basically divided in two, and there was kind of a line between that you could. There's kind of a safe zone where people who lived on one side could move to the other, and vice versa. And it kind of fluctuated between a frozen conflict and a hot conflict. It was just like that way for years on end.
yeah. And I personally think that here's a couple things. Like people who push Z, right?
Yeah.
They claim that that one, Russia and Ukraine are one nation, and that they're all they're all the same people, which is of course channeling like I guess both Dugin and Putin in some ways. It's a hyper nationalistic sentiment. They also claim that there was obviously a lot of Nazis there, and the denazification component was significant, which I thought it was always a bullshit justification, obviously. Not to say that there aren't, but that is not a real reason, especially considering that when you do invade a country, those nationalists are going to be hailed as heroes and will be able to, in the aftermath of the invasion, no matter which way it goes, they will always be a more, there will be people, that sentiment of nationalism will be galvanized because they will be seen as emancipators, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because they're the most militant factions.
Yeah, there's that. There's just whenever you have a war, it really stirs up nationalism and nationalistic resentments against the enemy. And you have like I'm watching people who I consider friends from Ukraine and who I would also consider to be sort of perfectly ordinary European liberals before the invasion. And now, I listen to them talk about Russians and, they'll use the word trolls or orcs or whatever. And you just have to, I'm not going to be too hard on somebody who's bunkered down in their basement during bombs for getting a little mad at people throwing bombs. But, it is happening. And I think that's one of the most ridiculous things about Putin's denazification rhetoric is this war is only going to intensify nationalistic sentiment in the country. It's definitely putting the political hard right in Ukraine in a better position than it was beforehand. Zelensky himself is, I would say, in danger. He can't, he's in a very bad position where if he bargains, he's going to be seen as selling his country out by a lot of Ukrainians and by the hard right. And that's how they're going to sell it. And, if I were him negotiating, I would want to do it outside of Ukraine and I would stay out of Ukraine afterwards. He's not going to want to go back.
Yeah.
But it just a word about the sort of Russian populations in Crimea and Donetsk and so on. It is true that Ukraine, Kiev was historically the capital of Russia. And there is this ultra nationalism in Putin sort of claiming them all for his, but it's nationalistic both ways. None of these, I guess I sort of take the old left socialist position that the nation state is always kind of this artificial reactionary institution and we need to get rid of it. And I look at this conflict through that lens because so much of it is about people defending borders and people sort of defining, okay, well, am I ethnically Russian, whatever that means, or ethnically Ukrainian? Even the language controversies are a little silly because Ukrainian is already very, very close to Russian, and depending on where you live, it's even closer. So we're talking about slight changes in vocabulary and spelling here, not even a massive change in the language.
Yeah. It's yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with you at all. I would say the same about, I mean, it's even closer from where I'm standing between like the similarities between Armenians and Turks or Greeks and Turks. Especially because like at least Armenians and Greeks are, they're Christian, whereas like the Turkish nation is predominantly Muslim. But overall, like the people look the same. There's obviously a different language there too, but like the people look the fucking same. The food is the same. The architecture is the same. The culture is pretty much the same. And yet there's like thousands of years of conflict. And in the situation with Ukraine and Russia, there's the similarities are way more prominent than the differences, and yet obviously no matter what happens, of course there's going to be nationalistic sentiment because the people have decided that this is their country, and I think that they have a right to obviously want to defend their homes from being fucking bombed.
Absolutely.
So the reason why I brought up the pushing Z conspiracists is specifically because of like how off base I think they are with respect to like how the invasion has gone thus far and what the outcomes have been for Russia, right?
Oh yeah.
Because like I think it's just copium to look at the situation and be like, no, this has been a phenomenal achievement. Like Ukraine will never join NATO now. I am a firm believer that the Western forces sold Ukraine down the line because they never genuinely were going to ever. I don't believe that they were ever going to let Ukraine into NATO. And that was just simply a thing that they dangled in front of Ukraine.
Absolutely. I mean,
a similar opinion that I have, and I wanted to hear your take on this. I think it exists within like the Turkish the peace plan or the ceasefire negotiations that took place in Turkey. The idea that like I think Zelensky maneuvered expertly in that situation where he said like we will do a referendum on Crimea 15 years down the line, which I think is like a really smart way to neutralize that hot potato, I guess. Saying like, of course we're gonna have a referendum. We're a democracy after all, which like should be should at least like quiet down more reactionary parts of the country that would have genuinely attacked him with nationalistic sentiment about like every inch of land being brought back into Ukraine, no matter what the cost of that would look like or whether it was even possible or not. And I think that I think that that kind of fell apart, at least according to reports at the time, with the additional confidence that was given to Zelensky and maybe internal pressure as well, but definitely additional confidence given to Zelensky by Boris Johnson visiting Ukraine. Am I overestimating Boris Johnson here and like what that meant for or what that decision was as far as like Western forces saying we're backing you the entire way? Or do you think that actually did play a role?
Well, I think, I saw one guy complaining about your take on that. And what I would respond to that is, ultimately, we really don't know what he said or what kind of pressure he put. We can sit here and do a lot of speculation, conjecture, and but there's no way to know about that for sure. That said, I think like the big thing that we're doing right now is, we are dangling the prospect of military aid in front of them. And, not just what we're giving, but of potentially ramping it up. And when you actually think about the degree of intervention that it would take to root Russians out of their positions where they're already entrenched, to do stuff to get them out of Crimea, to block off the borders. You need to do a lot of air control and you need to do a lot of Black Sea control. It's just utterly implausible that we are ever going to make that kind of commitment. But that is more or less how Ukraine is often defining victory now is, not giving up an inch of soil and Russia just kicked out completely. So there's something not connecting here. And I think that I actually tweeted this out yesterday. I think that hawks who want intervention, even if you want intervention, you have to start being honest about the fact that the U.S. just is not going to make that level of commitment.
Yeah,
it's not on the table. Like I think that realistically, we would have to have NATO troops on the ground because their big deficit right now is just manpower.
Yeah, that's the major problem. I think at this point is not even necessarily like the amount of weapons or munitions, which certainly is an issue still, obviously.
Yeah.
But the major issue is that there's just not enough people to
Yeah.
hold back.
And so they're trying to solve this problem with conscription, which has actually been going on for, almost really since the beginning of the war. Though it wasn't reported much, but like at the very beginning when Ukrainian men were trying to get out of the country, you would often get caught at the trains at the border and turned back. And I knew men who were just like hiding in Kiev. Um, I have another friend right now who has been living in a European country. I'm not going to say which one because honestly, I don't want people trying to track them down. Um, but I have a friend who's been living in a European country for a while. She has a kid. Her kid has only seen her father for the first month of his life, and it's approaching 2 years now. The husband is hiding in Ukraine, can't get out, but doesn't want to fight. This woman's brother is also hiding in Ukraine, doesn't want to fight. And it's not like they side with the Russians or anything like that. They just don't want to die, which is completely understandable. But this is a problem that we are creating directly. And you see, like, Americans online defending conscription of Ukrainians who don't want in this war. And it's just the most horrifying thing to me. Like,
They don't want to go fight.
yeah,
They can
exactly.
join the
Like,
Foreign Legion. It's like it's not you don't have to be a you don't have to
yeah,
like actively be an active duty service member. You can go and join. I know people on this very platform that have done that.
yeah.
I mean, fucking what? Robert F. Kennedy's son did it, didn't he? Like, I think.
Yeah. Well, this
So,
has always been, it's funny because this has always been an anti-war line is, calling people chicken hawks and saying, well, go ahead and join. And sort of the subtext there is nobody is going to join a war like this. Historically, just because it was actually pretty hard. But the strange thing about this war is it's really unusually easy for American civilians to get involved. Like, you
yeah,
don't have to have certain kinds of background. You're just flying over to sort of the edge of Europe. So you're not like
yeah. You
going
go to
into the
Poland.
jungles of Vietnam.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you can literally go to Poland, take a fucking
Yeah.
train into Ukraine, and join the Foreign Legion.
Yeah.
And I welcome all of the people who are like, no, this war should continue to go and
Yeah.
do that thing, to go and do that and fight. It's a just cause for first and foremost. I've been very
Yeah.
clear on my position, even though obviously, like, I have a very sizable leftist community online, and there are definitely disagreements on that front. I do personally think that it is a just cause that Ukraine has every right to defend itself
Oh, yeah.
from an invasion of a foreign
Yeah.
nation.
Yeah, I think that if you're a Ukrainian and you want to make that decision, you of course have every right to do that. I think that it's a very distinct question as to whether we should be sending weapons over there, or what kind of aid we should be sending. Uh, just because my assessment at this point is that continued U.S. involvement in this is going to cost more lives than it's going to save. And I think that if we find ways to start not only withdrawing that aid, but being honest with Ukraine and telling them we just aren't going to be able to get you the aid that you want, and even the levels you're currently getting are going to eventually start dropping. So you need to plan and make decisions about negotiations with that in mind. I think that that's the most responsible thing and the most positive thing that we can possibly do for the war. Even if they want to, keep fighting and defend themselves from attacks, God bless them, it's their right. But I think that we have a right to make decisions about how we want to be involved in this as well.
So, I don't know. Here's what I think. Okay,
Okay.
I think that perhaps if there was more training early on or more weapons delivered early on, maybe that there could have been a better defense planted. But the defense was relatively solid, all things considered, especially in comparison to like 2014, I guess, and like what the Ukrainian military looked like at the time versus what they were able to do in terms of like fending against like Russian air superiority early on. And I like maybe there's a different timeline where like if the aid wasn't so trickled that from a pure military position, like there could have been even more leverage on the Ukrainian side. I don't know how that would work, because I feel like you still run into the problem of like running out of people. I remember reading an assessment from this dude named Snake, I think. He's like some Ukrainian combat guy who was talking about how like it doesn't matter if there's one Russian guy sitting at a position. It doesn't matter if we have drones. We don't know how many people are there. And if it's one fucking Russian dude and it's a rusty ass and the one Russian conscript with a rusty ass fucking AK-47 is like holding a position, that's still dangerous for our guys, and it holds us up. It holds us up, and it takes a tremendous amount of time, even if it's one person. Now, play that out across the board on the field everywhere in Eastern Ukraine, and all of a sudden you arrive at the issue. It's like, in some ways it is. In some ways, it does literally feel like a old school trench warfare, or even like a war from a different era where, yes, like manpower in this circumstance, like the amount of people that you can throw at the problem in this circumstance does give you superiority on the ground.
There's this old sort of conventional wisdom among military strategists that it takes 7 people to get one person out of a defensive position.
Yeah,
That's how hard it is. So it's such an uphill battle at this point. And I think that I think you have a good point that, if you're going to intervene, you want to do it early and you want to do it hard.
but that's if your goal is. But that's if your goal. The reason why I brought this up. Sorry to cut you off again, even though you're the guest here. But the reason why I brought it up is because that's only if your goal actually is to help Ukraine. If your goal is to extend the conflict as you one, make a tidy profit for the military-industrial complex, and very openly say that with 5% of our military budget, we've been able to destroy 50% of a foreign adversary's army with not a single active duty service member dying in the process. If that is your actual goal, because it is a win-win from that perspective, then it's great. You trickle the weapons in slowly but surely. Okay, you give more of a comfortable runway to the American defense contractors anyway, so they don't like run out of resources. You recycle older surplus military equipment into Ukraine, and then you can go back to the government and be like, well, our reserves are depleted. Now we need more money. And all of that drives the economy in the United States of America. And I think that is the real American purpose here. That's why I always say that Ukraine is a just cause that America joined for, of course, the wrong reasons.
Yeah. I would say you always have to be careful about attributing intent to these kind of dynamics. I agree with you what is going on at this point, where, like the US definitely has a stake in drawing out this conflict for as long as possible, especially because of the, military contractor component and all of that. But a thing is that they sort of fall into that logic a lot of times without even necessarily any particular person, rubbing their hands and scheming to do so. It's just a thing where there are all these forces sort of pushing against the administration, really ramping up into a full-blown counteroffensive. But then there are all these, there's the MIC that's constantly lobbying for a continued presence in Ukraine, and sort of the way that those balance out end up extending the war in this horrible way. And it works for the benefit of capital. Absolutely. But you just always have to be careful about attributing intent there, because if you ask like any particular I'm sure that I'm sure that Biden himself probably genuinely wants to get Russia out of Ukraine. I think that he's probably thinking about it that way, and that whether he's actually willing to do what it takes, and whether he's being responsible about it, and whether he has bad incentives pushing him into a bad course of action, that's a different story. But there are like a lot of true believers in this cause out there who really are convinced that they're sort of fighting this World War III against Russian fascism. And so, which is all to say that I think early on in the war, if you had actually been able to make the case, hit them hard and fast immediately, I think that a lot of people in the administration would have actually bought that. In fact, we know from some of the reporting that a lot of people in the Biden administration were pushing for a much stronger response. And it was actually Biden who was a bit of a force of restraint at first. And I think that's probably kind of his role here still. He's just sort of naturally falling into drawing this out, because that's how these conflicts always end up going.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
The reason I push back on that a little is because I see leftists walk into a trap a lot of times, where we talk about this kind of perverse dynamic that capitalism pushes us into. And we talk about this is what they intended, or this is what they meant to do. And then it's very easy for the hawks and the liberals and so on to gotcha and be like, where's your evidence that they intended that? Like, where do you have a recording of Joe Biden saying this? Like, and
Yeah.
so what ends up happening is you start trying to do this dot connecting stuff where you're like, well, we made this
well, Joe Biden did say it, to be fair. Like, he openly mentioned it as he was like trying to sell the aid package, the $95 billion aid package, like last week or a couple days ago, actually, as it passed through the Senate, where he openly said, like, you guys don't understand. We're not like dropping, bags of cash into Ukraine. We're actually like, this money is going back to our weapons, our facilities. Like, this money is hiring more American hands. And this was a calculated messaging effort that was leaked to Politico by the Biden camp, I suspect, I assume. Maybe like a month prior. I remember reading an article about this specifically on how to sell the idea of weapons aid to the American public, because it is true. And I don't think it's a conspiracy in the sense that like it's a conspiracy theory. I think it's a conspiracy in the truest sense of the word. They are conspiring because we are aligned on I think they're aligned on class interests in this situation.
Yeah.
It's just like it's a normal collaboration. It's the same thing that like I guess Noam Chomsky talks about quite frequently with respect to people that get elevated into higher and higher positions in American media. They would not be there. There's no like deliberate attempt.
Yeah.
Where someone goes, I know what I'm saying is untrue, and that's why I'm saying it. It's more, or someone gave me orders to say these things. It's not a conspiracy theory in that sense. It's more so they do genuinely believe it, and their interests do align, and therefore, they advocate for these things.
I think we're agreeing. I think that I'm just always sort of reflexively like every time I hear somebody start talking about intents and especially like secret intents, I get a little nervous because this is just like the liberal playbook where every single time that you start doing that, they gotcha on that. Or it's like you see the same thing that happens a lot of times when you have journalists who are very clearly hawks and who have very obvious conflicts of interest in the way that they talk about and cover this war. And so, people sort of colloquially say, well, they're bought off, or they're in the bag or whatever. And they are in this informal sense that you're talking about. But if you actually put it that way, they always come back and say, oh, you actually think that I'm getting paid by Zelensky to say this? Where's your proof? They do
Yeah.
that kind of stuff
But I
all the
mean,
time.
it's not Zelensky.
Obnoxious.
In many
Yeah.
instances is like directly Raytheon. You have a
Yeah.
former general go on CNN and do a
Yeah.
PowerPoint presentation on HIMARS, and very openly you look at their background, and they're just straight up like they're doing lobbying for Raytheon actively while they're live on TV. Talking about their perspective on the war as though it's like as though they have no other nefarious secondary reason for saying the things that they are saying. And in my opinion, that is like, that's the, when I say someone's bought off, that's what I mean in the most reductive terms. Regardless though, like I said, it's the entire system is designed in this way, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's Israel or anywhere else where America is involved in the affairs of another country, involving itself or greatly accelerating tensions, trying to start conflict. It's all it's all at the behest of the profit margins for weapons, for defense contractors in general. Now, moving away from the things like the peace negotiations, I do want to talk a little bit more about like where we're at this point, because the counteroffensive at this stage is an abject failure. This was propped up and sold to the American public for those who are still interested in Ukraine, or were still interested in Ukraine maybe 6 months ago, where this was going to be an active effort to completely rid the eastern territories of any kind of Russian invasion, and it failed. And now it's a cold stalemate with as many people suspected, with Russia every now and then bombing Western positions, and Ukraine bombing even inside of Russia every now and then, and it's just like pot shots at this point, minefields. There is a need for artillery. A lot of those munitions we are, I guess, running out of because of the fact that we just don't have like a straight up World War II style war economy where every single resource is going directly into building weapons. So now you also have Israel, and they need dumb bombs as well. This was even before October 7th, where America had to tap in to South Korea, a nation with a lot of artillery for obvious reasons, to basically resupply Ukraine. And then after Israel's ethnic cleansing campaign began post October 7, now our attention has shifted over there and our resources have shifted over there. So Ukraine is in a really bad position now.
If what I would sort of say is, I think that the number one problem that's going to face Ukraine in the end is actually domestic. I think that the conscription issue is much more politically destabilizing than people really get at this point, but you can see it. And it's not, by the way, just coming from people avoiding being conscripted. It's also on the other side, you have families of soldiers who've been there from the beginning complaining and saying, they've been fighting all this time. They should be able to take some time off while all these other people who've been home all the time go out and fight. So this is like the war is really coming home in that sense to Ukraine, where it's becoming more and more difficult for your average ordinary person to hide from it or to get away from it. You know, you could sort of move out west a bit, or you could flee the country. And you know, if you were like, say, in Lvov or something like that, you might still face the occasional missile flying over there. But it was relatively sort of a stable situation. I get there are other economic problems and stuff like that, but I think that ultimately it's just a meat grinder there at the front lines. If they can't just keep sending, they can't keep raising the conscription age ceiling, and you know, sort of scraping the bottom of the barrel more and more, putting prisoners out there and stuff like that. Eventually, it's going to turn into a political problem where you have people running on either ending conscription, which will end the war, or just flat out ending the war itself, for the simple reason that it's just hurting Ukrainians, ordinary Ukrainians, too much. And I think that that is probably a more likely settlement at this point. I don't think Zelensky is really in a position where he can settle now. I just don't, because the politics of it, the way that the right has him over a barrel, and it will just seem everybody is going to read it as him selling the country out if he does it now. And I saw one guy, one of your critics, talking about, well, America would come in and rescue Zelensky or something.
Huh.
No, we aren't.
No,
Like,
that's the funniest part, because like it doesn't make sense. People always like the extremely online side of this conflict is like obviously petty and annoying, because like American foreign policy is going to be what it is no matter what the fuck we say on Reddit, right? You can watch you can watch all the drones drop grenades on Russian orcs footage all you want on subreddits, and no matter how much you fantasize about that sort of thing, like your opinion is completely irrelevant when it comes to American foreign policy, right? Or you can be pushing Z, it doesn't fucking matter. There's nothing that we can say or do. However, one thing that I will never understand, if we are going to talk about like you know, the Reddit side or the Twitter NATO defenders and whatnot, the one thing that's always really interesting to me is that like, if this was a matter of like Ukrainians and what their wants and what their interests are, okay, we would have instituted Article 5. We would have brought in Ukraine into NATO. Do you think Ukrainians don't want that? Of course they want that. They want to be defended. They want Western forces to come in and defend Ukraine. Like, no Ukrainian is going to say no to that. It's completely understandable that they would say that. But there's a reason why we don't do that. Well, because of the obvious pressures and the potential for nuclear holocaust, or at least like, I remember this was like really prescient at the time. I thought it was really interesting. There was a moment where like the American State Department cutouts would go into like CNN and whatnot, and maybe briefly talk about the potential for a mini nuke, like certain parts. Do you remember this?
Yeah.
This was like they like when they brought that up, I was like, holy shit! Like there's a real situation that like Russia could deploy a tactical nuke, and they're like, it seems like they're kind of trying to get ahead of it. Like
that was, I think that was mostly brinksmanship. You know, Europe wouldn't let them do that because you know, you face like depending on where they drop it, you face potential fallout problems in Poland or wherever.
No, absolutely.
Or Romania, I guess. But I thought that was mostly just sort of posturing and brinksmanship, and just, you know, especially like a lot of the sort of the NAFO guys and a lot of these folks really do not have, they're out of touch with what the Biden administration is actually doing and what they want, because you can see like they're talking, we want a full-on invasion, and we want to, like, some of them will actually start talking about going into Moscow. and overthrowing Putin and doing stuff like that. And it's just like the administration is nowhere near that. Or like, remember, the counteroffensive, and they were extremely bullish on that. And then afterwards, you find out that the administration was like, we have our doubts. We don't think this is going to work. So yeah, I'm always very, very skeptical. I guess it depends on who they actually have talking. It's one thing for somebody actually in the Pentagon right now, or an administration official or someone like that to be making those statements. But when it's just like some random ex-Pentagon guy who's gone into private contracting or decided he wants to become an influencer or whatever, that's when I start becoming skeptical of those kind of statements.
Yeah. Um, I guess what I was trying to say is that it's not. I mean, we're aligned on this. I think that like there is a extent to how much we are willing to support Ukraine in this, in their just cause of wanting to be rid of this invasion, and that much. Like that much is clear. That's an undeniable fact, right? There is no fly zone over Ukraine. That's not, and I don't personally think that would be a good idea anyway, because of the obvious reality of the matter, given what the Russian retaliation could look like potentially, greatly escalating the conflict into NATO states, or at least like testing the boundaries in American interest in like how much they're willing to defend Poland, for example. Does that make sense? Like, because I believe that like I don't think America gives a shit about Poland either. Like the extent of which they give a shit about Poland is like what that says about NATO and how it exists, right? Like it's more so like you're not defending Poland because you care about Poland. You're defending Poland because like you have to defend NATO nations, or else there's no reason for NATO to exist at all. So it greatly undermines the entire purpose of NATO if you don't defend Poland. So but clearly they have none of that consideration for Ukraine whatsoever, despite the fact that Ukrainians understandably want it. So I guess I ask all my interlocutors that that they should extend that way of thinking into why. Like how much we care about Ukrainian considerations and Ukrainian emancipation in our efforts to defend Ukraine. That's why I always have said that I think it's important to be realistic with Zelensky from the jump, and even urge if you were an honest a person engaging in like diplomacy, you would be like, yeah, at a certain point this has to end, and this is the extent of the help that we can give you, and we got to start. We have to start the conversation around ceasefire and peace talks.
Yeah, all you have to do is look at what Zelensky's asks have been, like what kind of aid he wants in sort of an ideal scenario, and compare that to what we're actually giving him. And it's never that. We never really come anywhere near what he's asking for. And these are kind of his baseline, like minimum. This is not even, he still talks about this as if he can win this war just with Ukrainian ground troops and stuff like that. And I don't think that that's even viable anymore. So I don't think that even he is being all that realistic about what it would take. But even by his standards, we aren't coming anywhere close to it. And I think that this is sort of the winning argument about this, because you can bypass all of these questions about should we be helping them, and what's sort of the just course of action for the US to take in terms of sending them weapons. You can get around that once you acknowledge the reality of what's going on. And once you get past that and say, hey, but that's not what's going to happen. So acknowledging that, what is your second best outcome here? What's your damage control approach to this situation on the assumption that we aren't going to give them enough aid to win.
Yeah. So a couple things I want to talk to you about is Zaluzhny and the I guess domestic dispute between the former general commander of the Ukrainian ground forces and the new commander of the Ukrainian ground forces. I shared my screen with you. Are you seeing it?
Yeah. Yeah. I see it.
And also, of course, I want to talk about Navalny. Actually, as a matter of fact, I'm going to go into Navalny right now, and I want to play this. I want to play this out real quick, partially because I want to go pee while I play this out real quick, and then not the whole thing, but I'll pause it and we'll get back to it in a second. But I'm going to do that right now, okay? And you can hear it too.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about Navalny a little bit, and then we'll get back to Zaluzhny.
Clear my mind here a little bit and not say what I'm really thinking. But let me be clear. This is an outrageous thing for a president to say. I can't fathom. From Truman on, they're rolling over in their graves hearing this. As long as I'm president, America stands by our sacred commitment to our NATO allies, as they have stood by their commitments to us repeatedly. Putin and the whole world should know, if any adversary were to attack us, our NATO allies would back us. And if Putin were to attack a NATO ally, the United States will defend every inch of NATO territory. Now's the time for even greater unity among our NATO allies, to stand up to the threat that Putin's Russia poses. You know, I send my deepest condolences to Alexei's staff and supporters. We're going to continue his work despite this loss, despite all of Putin's desperate attempts to stamp out the opposition, and most of all to his family, especially to his wife, his daughter, and his son, who've already sacrificed so much for their family and a shared dream for a better future for Russia. So I just want to say God bless Alexei Navalny. His courage will not be forgotten, and I'm sure it will not be the only courage we see coming out of Russia in the near term. Thank you. I'll be happy to take a couple questions.
Sir, first, was this an assassination?
The answer is we don't know exactly what happened, but there is no doubt that the death of Navalny was a consequence of something that Putin and his thugs did.
And to be clear, you warned Vladimir Putin when you were in Geneva of devastating consequences if Navalny died in Russian custody. What consequences
He did say that.
Should he?
He did say that. So what do you think? My assessment is like I don't think we'll ever know what the real situation on hand is. I don't know if there's like a lot of political reasons leading up to an election, because this will cause like a little bit of internal disruption no matter what. And he was already arrested and in prison anyway. I think it's more so like I do agree that he definitely did allow Navalny to die in prison at the very least, and therefore is directly responsible for his death, of course.
Yeah.
But I don't know if it's like a direct poisoning situation or if it's like he just fucking died because of the horrible conditions because he had poisoned them prior.
I'm assuming that he had him killed.
Yeah.
I think that seems pretty safe to me, just because
he does do that a lot.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of his thing, and there's no real reason to doubt it. The sort of political logic of doing it right now has a little bit to do with elections. I think it's hard to say, but I'm not really giving Putin the benefit of a doubt on this. There's no need to.
No, I like, no matter what, it is his fault regardless. Like, obviously.
Yeah. I had
unless he was vaccinated.
Yeah, like when I lived in Moscow, and I was at Moscow State University, which is one of these beautiful old castles they have in Moscow that Stalin built. And I was up on, I think, like the 8th floor, and this was right around when tensions with Georgia were really ramping up, and they were being very, very hard on Georgian immigrants at the time, closing down their businesses, banning Georgian products. You'd see Georgians getting beat up out in the streets and stuff like that. Well, one day, I had a Georgian neighbor who lived across from me. One day, the militia comes and knocks at his door, and I heard the knocking, and I thought it might be my door. So I open up my door and look out, and these two, they're sort of quasi-military, quasi-police guys are standing there. And, I asked them what's going on, and they're just like, "Всё хорошо," it's all good, go away. And so I went away, and then I eventually heard somebody let them in. And then the next day, I find out that my Georgian roommate mysteriously fell out the window and died.
That's
And
a common cause of death, I think.
yeah,
Seems like
yeah,
seems like a
yeah,
normal occurrence. I mean, otherwise, if it wasn't natural, why
yeah.
does it happen so much, Carl?
Yeah, and like I've had friends who have been beat up over there. I was myself at one point followed by like these militia guys with dogs, and they're clearly watching. It was after I attended Anna Politkovskaya's wake, which is a lot like Navalny's right now, the murdered journalist, and they're putting flowers all out front, and they had some cops just kind of standing there watching the people who came to pay their respects. And I think they probably heard me speaking English, and so they sort of followed me for a few blocks, I think, just to see where I was going to go, probably to intimidate me too. So, it's like that kind of thing happens in Russia, and I don't want to overstate it. You had one liberal yesterday saying that they arrest you if you criticize their grocery stores, and that doesn't happen at all. Everybody loves to complain about their grocery stores in Eastern Europe, but this I would not put this past Putin.
Yeah. Wait, did you see the video of Navalny one day prior to his death in good health in prison? Definitely evidentiary he was put out and not sick, but who knows? This is court video of Navalny in Russian prison day before reported death. Seems to show Putin critic in good health. First of all, I like that they're saying he seems to be in good health. My man has lost like 80 fucking pounds here. He looks like a victim, okay? But I mean, it's seemingly he doesn't look like he's gonna die one day later. So
Yeah.
I get why they're showing this.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's talk about Navalny's background a little bit, because I'm of the mindset that, and I laugh about this all the time because like sometimes people will come into the chat and be like, Hasan, you don't understand the communist. There's a communist party in Russia, and it's like, no, there is no real opposition within the existing political infrastructure in Russia to Vladimir Putin. There's only controlled opposition. And then I guess like anything that's outside of said controlled opposition is usually backed by Western parties, Western forces. But yeah, I feel like Alexei Navalny is no different in that situation. Like he's like, obviously Putin is a villain of in every sense of the word, regardless of his own personal motivations and interests and whatnot. But like he is not a good guy. But I would not say that Navalny is a good guy either, right?
No, he's a right-wing ethno-nationalist.
Yeah.
Extremely anti-Muslim. It's been surreal watching folks sort of valorize him simply because he's been in the opposition to
They
Putin.
did that to fucking what's his face? Prigozhin, right? I mean, they did that to fucking the head of Wagner.
Yeah. I mean,
because he was marching into Russia. Like it was so mind-boggling to me that it's more like it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who it is. Like if you're standing against Putin, like we love you, and it's like, the fuck do you mean? Like that's insane.
Yeah, he's he is a particularly bad guy, and I think that there's the various charges about him against him. Let's see, there was the extremism charge, and that was about sort of fomenting nationalism and basically Nazi propaganda type stuff. And the punishment is wrong, but the charge was correct. That's absolutely what he did. And then they hit him with a terrorism charge on basically the exact same grounds.
Yeah, this is also deeply hypocritical, obviously, because like there are plenty of ultra nationalist sentiment in Russia as well, and
Yeah.
as long as they're aligned with the government, chat that doesn't like they're fine, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. Like they're not. It's not because they're woke by any means or genuinely anti-Nazi by any means. So I hope you understand that. I don't think Carl is saying that like that Navalny is like a guy who, or the only guy who was an extremist and an ultra nationalist, ethno nationalist of this sense in Russia.
Oh, not at all. And I mean, one thing that I think you don't see people talk about in the discourse so much is, you have sort of in Ukraine, you have the Azov, like sort of ultra nationalist Nazis whose allegiance is specifically to Ukraine, and who idolize Bandera and that sort of thing. But then you do have these sort of hard right Nazi fascist movements in Russia, in Ukraine, that are sort of a bit on the fence of who they were going to support. And you saw that in the United States too. You still see that sometimes where you have Nazis here sort of trying to decide, okay, well, we like the Azov guys, but we also like Putin, and we don't like, like if they're both Russia and Ukraine have a serious Nazi problem. I don't personally think that it's much more significant than ours. I think the only real difference is that if the Nazis get in power in the US, like if say Trump takes power, our institutions have been pretty resilient and capable of handling him. If you have a hard line, some Azov guy who gets swept into power because of his popularity, he's associated with the war or whatever, in Ukraine, they don't have the kind of institutions there, the court system, that kind of thing, or the electoral institutions. They're capable of dealing with somebody like that. And in fact, Zelensky's responsible for destroying a lot of that because he's going around and banning parties. We're really moving back towards the sort of old inter-elite struggles that used to really define Ukrainian politics. And it's getting really, really factionalized between this hawkish side and then sort of I would say moderate sort of European liberal, that's Zelensky's faction. I know that a lot of people understandably associate him with Azov and with the Nazis and so on, but that's really not his political faction. That's not where he's going to end up if there's a serious political breakdown.
Yeah.
And Zaluzhny, the Zaluzhny firing is a big part of that because I think that a lot of that comes from the fact that Zaluzhny is just an extraordinarily popular figure in Ukraine, like war heroes often are, while Zelensky's popularity has been steadily falling. And I think that he sort of recognizes a political threat when he sees one and is probably trying to neutralize it, by putting somebody else in and taking him out of power. Who knows how that's going to actually work, but I think that's probably what his actual logic is.
What would you say about Zelensky's I guess like military prowess, if you wanna dive into that a little bit? Like from what I understand, he was like a little bit more restrained about like what he thought was possible on the ground. In comparison to like Zelensky being a political figure, wanting to maintain his power, maintain his grip on power, or maybe even wanting to propagandize their position so that like people don't so that there aren't like domestic issues, right? Because like there's always a potential for domestic upheaval when people realize that like maybe the war isn't going in the way that that they thought it would be, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So
It's I guess
sorry, go ahead.
there's a long tradition of generals and people who are actually in the military having a more realistic assessment of what's going on in the ground and their chances than the political leadership. So that doesn't surprise me. I think it is like the one thing I do wonder about is if he gets political, if he actually becomes a political figure, maybe starts challenging Zelensky, is his line going to be is he going to make a pivot towards saying Zelensky is a traitor and he's selling out Ukraine, he's not fighting to the last inch, or is he going to take this more pragmatic, this war is lost and we need to defend Ukrainian lives and stuff like that? I'm really that's going to be a crucial question, I think, and it's very hard for me to sort of guess where he would go with that. But it's gonna tell us a lot about the state of Ukrainian politics because it's going to tell us, Zaluzhny, a lot of his power base is going to come from the hard nationalist right, and if they are becoming pessimistic about winning the war, then everybody is. It seems like they would be the last holdouts.
What ideological faction is he from? Though Zelensky, like, what would he align with? Do you know? I don't know. That's why I'm asking.
No, I mean it's difficult to talk about Ukrainian politics in terms of ideology because it's not the same way that ours are, where different parties and different candidates always necessarily map onto distinct political programs. In Ukraine, it's often just a lot of oligarchs sort of vying for power on kind of similar anti-corruption platforms, and maybe sort of historically one major difference was just, are they going to be more aligned with Russia, or are they going to be more aligned with the EU? So that's probably about as political as I think he would get, and I think that his preference there is more aligned with the EU and not Russia. But it's precisely because Ukrainian politics aren't ideological in the same way that it's hard to predict where he's going to go. Everything sort of depends, I think, on the political mood among the hard right, which are going to be, they aren't going to be his biggest base, but they're going to be his most militant and activist and politically influential base, I think. And they're going to have a lot of credibility because they're going to be, talking about their war experience and stuff like that.
Okay. So ultimately, it doesn't really matter. There's like chatters in here saying that he's like a Banderite, or that he's like a hyper nationalistic, or that he marched with right sector. I'm not familiar with his background at all. Do you mind diving into that a little bit, or is that too much of a hot potato? I want to know what your perspective on this is, because like I grew up in Turkey, okay?
Yeah.
And as someone who grew up in Turkey, like, ultra nationalists play a very prominent, very significant role in Turkish politics. So oftentimes I am a bit more, I wouldn't say forgiving, but I don't have the same like American lens when it comes to when it comes down to like assessing nationalist figures, especially as like emancipatory figures. I get that like the average citizen could potentially be a part of a group like that without and still be like a normal person and not like an American Nazi, because there's no political representation for like the American Nazi Party, and most Americans are, I guess, like their position is that they are nationalist, like and we reaffirm that through every outlet, like the national anthem before the NFL games and things of that nature, like that creates like a normal fascistic center for every single American to like abide by without aligning themselves with like a significant ultra nationalist cause, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas in Europe and in European countries where there's like multiple parties, I feel like there is a more like there's a more official role that people align with. So I guess the question for you is like as far as Bandera, as far as nationalistic, as far as the prominence of nationalism, is this overstated, or is it seen as like a normal figure, or
I think,
is it? Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. So what I would say, I made the comparison to fascism in the U.S. earlier, and I guess like what has happened, the way that I see this is that a lot of the folks who align themselves with Zaluzhny, a lot, or well, yeah, him too. But Zaluzhny is actually a good example here, because I doubt that he is a Nazi in the sense of having this, Jewish people are parasites and the Aryan race is superior and all of that kind of stuff. The actual specific ideology that we associate historically with Nazism. But he is finding himself and deliberately aligning himself with Banderites. And like he posted a picture on Facebook recently of him with a prominent right sector guy. He's
Yeah,
actually
here it is. Yeah.
yeah. And with the old red and black flag in the background.
Yeah.
And sort of the danger, there's kind of two dangers associated with Azov and with this Ukrainian nationalism in general that I see, which is that they end up like if they were just sort of very gung-ho Ukrainians and into Ukrainian history and stuff like that, they would just be ordinary nationalists. But because they have associated themselves with Bandera and with this sort of historical struggle against the Soviet Union.
Yeah, USSR, exactly.
Yeah, what that ends up doing is it sort of pushes them towards apologetics of the actual German Nazi party, just because they will get hit with charges of sympathy for them, and they'll have to say, well, look, they're, the communists were just as bad, and they'll end up saying stuff like that. And so they become this force for Nazi apologetics, regardless of what they privately believe. And
it goes back to the same principle, though. It's like when you are invaded, these figureheads they lend themselves so perfectly to building a nationalist mythos. And all of a sudden, even if you didn't give a fuck about Bandera, you're like, well, okay, these guys are saying that he's bad. And they're a continuation of the USSR, and they're invading my country. So maybe this Bandera guy has some good fucking ideas. And obviously, a lot of those ideas were, for those of you who don't fucking know in the chat, aligning with Nazis, killing Polish people, killing a shit ton of Jewish Ukrainians. And, even if you personally are not like, yeah, those were good things, you end up, I guess, finding yourself in the same exact predicament that the Canadian Parliament found itself a couple months back. Your anti-communist sentiment ends up causing you to align with out and about direct Nazis.
Yeah. And that's how it often goes.
Yeah.
A lot of Nazis didn't think of themselves as Nazis in the sense of being bigots or being there's some good old essays on this by like or Theodore Adorno, just talking about how a lot of Nazis can envision themselves, and a lot of them were actually very sort of opportunistic and pragmatic about it and not so ideological, but they ended up being a part of this whole ideological apparatus anyway, and you get swept up in it. And so that's, like if for example I hear somebody in Ukraine say Slava Ukraina, which a lot of people just do as a toast, Um, they were doing that before the war, had nothing to do really with, like, these are people who think that the right sector is ridiculous, but it's very much like saying God bless America in the US. It's just kind of a banal nationalist sentiment to a lot of people, but now that has become associated with the Banderite movement, the post-Banderite movement. Um, and so, yeah, you have this really dangerous dynamic. Again, I don't think that it's more prolific in Ukraine than it is like in the US. But the danger is that a lot of these people are proximate to power. Um, like you did have right sector people in the Rada at one point. Their numbers really diminished since their peak, and I think it was like 2013, 2014, around then. Their numbers really significantly diminished since then, but you do have sort of open Banderites in government positions in a way that you don't, like, you have people like Trump, or you have sort of figures in the right in the US who just are de facto fascists, but they aren't openly aligning themselves in that way. So the difference is a kind of semantic. I think it does matter, but I worry more about the radicalizing effect that Trump's invasion is having, a lot more than I worry about like some dumbass Ukrainian conscript who was handed a military uniform because they only have so many and it had an Azov patch on it. And we don't even know if he identifies with them or not, because they're just handing these uniforms out. And a lot of people don't really know or care what that means. Like, I don't think that your typical Ukrainian would look at a Sonarad, for example, and associate that with Nazis, or really even know what that is. Certainly, U.S. leftists do, but I don't know that that is how a lot of Ukrainians perceive it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, these are all um byproducts of being invaded. Like, that's the way I see it. I still lay the blame almost entirely on Putin's hands, as far as like the insidious nature of nationalistic symbolism creeping into public consciousness. I do
Yeah.
think that there is like a really scary secondary implication for such things.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and
and
what
also, I think that the Western world plays a role in normalizing that exhibition.
yeah. Oh,
Um,
yeah. There's a wild narrative around a while back. I don't know if you remember, there was that shooter who they found like a Sonarad in his diary or something, and they associated him with Ukraine. And some folks were actually talking about how Ukrainians were radicalizing Americans. And I don't think that's the main dynamic. I think it's going the other way mostly. I think that we are exporting fascism in kind of the sense that you're talking about, more than they are importing it to us. Another a dynamic that really gets overlooked here, that really has contributed to the rise of nationalism in Ukraine, is just the fall of the Soviet Union, and deteriorating living standards there.
yeah.
And the fact that, like, say what you will about the Soviet Union, but it was very openly and aggressively sort of anti-nationalist, and their whole, like, it's still this way in Russia, where the Great Patriotic War, like, just the defeat of Nazis is held in such reverence. And
Yeah.
it was very important to Ukrainians too. And so you have like
Yeah, there were
this
significantly
thing.
more Ukrainians that fought in the Red Army as opposed
Yeah.
to like aligning with Bandera and or joining like the SS Galicia, right? Like
Yeah.
this is like
Yeah.
a marginal nationalistic movement that aligned with the Nazis that is now like I guess becoming more I would say becoming more prominent as a consequence of like the nationalism that
Yeah.
comes from wanting to free yourself of an invading force.
Yeah.
It almost justifies in their eyes, in the eyes of many people. I feel like it certainly justifies their framework where it's like, well, okay, well, this guy's not fucking wrong because like he didn't want to be bombed or he didn't want to be killed in the way that my family's being killed currently.
Yeah.
And
It's
and I guess the point I was trying to make is that like I feel like the Western media played a role in like normalizing a lot of what we see here as well, in the sense that like there are obviously plenty of fucking Ukrainians in the Ukrainian armed forces that are not Nazis or nationalists of any sort whatsoever, but it feels like I was taking crazy pills when like every single fucking time that they were interviewing someone, it would be like a guy whose nickname is Adolf, who like
Yeah.
has a fucking black sun tattoo, and
Yeah.
he's like the leader of the you know the militia training group or some shit. And it's like, well, why are you interviewing this guy? Like, shouldn't you be trying to desperately hide this guy? Like, that's what I
Yeah.
never understood. Like, why is it that the Associated Press was doing this, and was it that like the Ukrainian armed forces was not like trying to deal with it on the PR front?
You know, part of it has to do with the way that the war has gone. So, for example, you know, you had that siege at Azovstal, which was in Mariupol, which
Yeah.
was being largely defended by Azov battalion folks. You have Lvov in the sort of western part of the country, which is a very Banderite, sort of very nationalistic city compared to some. Like I remember when I visited there, you could get Bandera T-shirts at their gift shops and stuff like that. Um, and meanwhile, a lot of the folks who would be sort of inclined to oppose that or object to that kind of stuff, I think that a lot of them are actually concentrated in the East and like a lot of them really. I mean, you know, your average Ukrainian, I talk about this with another Ukrainian friend all the time. Like, if you're out in the middle of, you know, some farm out in Donetsk or something, like in the region, you don't really care if your tax dollars are going to Putin or Zelensky. You mostly just want to be left alone. Um, and you don't really have like and that's one of the reasons why I don't really worry so much about what parts of Ukraine end up in Putin's hands, because it's not going to change the lives of many people, honestly. But I think like a lot of sort of systematically, a lot of the sort of Ukrainians who would be more inclined to be skeptical of that stuff are away from the eyes of the media, are shut out of it. And the ones that we do see in the media all the time are either people in the military and specific parts of the military, like Azovstal, which we talked about, or they tend to be these sort of ultra, like extremely online NGO employees in Kiev
Yeah.
who
For
mostly
sure.
make their living doing this stuff. You know, they're getting paid to go on social media and attack Russia and defend Ukraine against charges of fascism and stuff like that. So I think there is systematic bias, but it's still just it's still bizarre. Like it's an unforced PR error, right? Like if you're Zelensky, you don't need to be fighting this fight with the West at the same time. Put out your guys who aren't Nazis, like in your photo opportunities and stuff like that. Screen them out. Why are you making these mistakes?
Yeah, I don't understand that part. And I don't understand why like the Western world, which is like certainly before the Russian invasion of 2022, was like very critical of the Zelensky government, talking about corruption, like the same like Voices of America
Yeah.
beats that are State Department owned and operated would like regularly criticize the Zelensky government for corruption, regularly even write about like Ukraine's Nazi problem and things of that nature. So much so that the American government had to actually take initiative and literally pass legislation. Many chatters don't know this because they didn't fucking know about Ukraine until 2022, but they had to pass legislation under they had to pass legislation to stop funding and arming specifically the Azov Battalion because they were out and about open neo-Nazis. You could say that like they are not the brunt or the majority of the forces, which is of course certainly true, something that I agree with. And you can certainly say that Putin's justification of denazification is ridiculous, which I also agree with. It is ridiculous. It's fucking bullshit. He should denazify his own country, really. But having said all of that, the fact that they just like completely dropped all of that and even like the most like Western focused people regularly say that like the black sun tattoo is actually not that significant that this guy has, and his nickname is Adolf because it's like cutesy. I think that plays a role in like basically solidifying propaganda for like some of these very far right forces that will inevitably cause problems for Zelensky or any kind of like even Western focused leadership that tries to take a more centrist position, right? As a matter of Ukrainian freedom, as a matter of like trying to stop the bleeding, stop the hemorrhaging. If you were to ever capitulate in any way, shape, or form, if you were to concede on any of these issues, then you leave yourself out to a major opening from far right elements to come in and be like, you're fucking collaborating with the Russians, you're a Russian op, and institute a coup d'etat, or even just like directly win the elections, right? If there ever is one. And I think that it is wildly irresponsible not to see the writing on the wall here and not to think about like Ukrainian independence later down in the future. And what that's going to look like, what Ukraine is going to look like, not right now, not a year from now, but 5 years from now. And I think that we are being wholeheartedly irresponsible, and there will be many thought pieces written, retrospectives in a similar capacity. Our friends will make Blowback season 10 at that point about how did the far right win so much in Ukraine after the Russian invasion and whatnot? And we'll talk about how the media absolutely fucking capitulated to these and normalized a lot of these like far right positions in Ukraine. And I don't know, it's really fucking scary to think about, especially because this country is one that is heavily connected to Europe. And what those implications will have for European politics, or even like direct acts of violence within Europe, all the weapons that we've given that are not accounted for. All of that is just like terrifying. It's America doing what America does in Afghanistan and in the Middle East, but this time doing it in Eastern Europe.
Yeah. And I mean, like you were saying about the West opposing this stuff before the war. I had a friend who's actually running a prominent NGO over there, and they would do stuff like, for example, they would organize a pride parade over there because they do a lot of like LGBT advocacy work in Ukraine. And you would have these Azov guys like show up with baseball bats. And so you had people from the NGOs, and I actually went with them to one of them, just walking with them at the parade so that you could have numbers in case the Azov or the right sector guys tried to start something. And they were regarded as a menace by, certainly by people doing that kind of advocacy, by a lot of sort of the liberalizing, like really honestly Soros aligned NGOs and organizations over there. People whose whole mission is about anti-corruption and quote European values and neoliberalization and stuff like that. They actually saw the Nazi stuff as an impediment to their agenda.
Yeah.
But now you see that as soon as it becomes convenient, all of that resistance just evaporates. And that's one of the sort of problems with trying to change a country like Ukraine from the top down with these NGO liberalization initiatives is there's no base at the bottom really that you're reaching. And so all of the progress you're making is just totally artificial. It's consigned to the wealthiest upper 20% of Kiev residents who all want to get a job at an NGO, so they go to all the events and meetings and stuff like that. Like those are the people that sort of these liberalizing organizations are really doing a lot for, but not for the rank and file that your common Ukrainian citizen. And that again was a role that communism really played, where it really improved the quality of life for a lot of people, guaranteed them a social safety net, which now we are gradually stripping away in the war. You have guys in the US right now, I forget which think tank he works for. There's a guy in the US warning about welfare queens in Ukraine, wrote a paper about this, where he thinks that they're going to have this problem of Ukrainians taking advantage of U.S. humanitarian aid, and that will disincentivize them from getting work. So he is arguing against just giving them basic humanitarian aid on those grounds, and absolutely sinister stuff. And that is the kind of stuff that does ruin lives and that does make people become desperate and turn to nationalism. So yeah, we're playing a major role in that as well.
Absolutely.
Ukraine is one of the first articles I wrote about Ukraine was back in 2014 when both Russia was trying to bring it into its customs union, its own trade union. The EU was trying to bring it into its own union. They were playing extremely hardball, and these were being, of course, driven by capital in both of their countries. And it was very clear that this was having a destabilizing effect on Ukraine. And what I wrote back then is, the most likely outcome here is that Ukraine is just going to be torn apart and shredded between these two reactionary forces that are just trying to monopolize it for themselves. And that's exactly what's happened.
Yeah, it is devastating. I don't know where it will go. It does. I just know that it's not going to be good, and it's not good so far, and it's not going to get any better. It seems anytime soon. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, the only sort of good outcome I can possibly imagine here is if Zelensky were to just have some kind of revelation and do something truly heroic and go to the negotiating table, risking his own life to do it because of the potential reaction. He is really the figure who is in a position to possibly bring a peace to Ukraine before the right brings its own peace to Ukraine. And we aren't going to like it when that happens.
Yeah. So I guess there's the other side of this bargain. One thing I do want to talk to you about before I let you go, because I've had you here for an hour now, is Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin, right? He just did a almost 3 hour long interview with Tucker Carlson, and he spent the first 40 minutes of that 3 hour interview talking a whole bunch about how Ukraine and Russia are one nation. Now, there's some truth to that in terms of like family members, right? Like Ukrainians have Russian family members and vice versa. Okay, similar language, all this stuff. But I feel like he basically really leaned into all of the arguments that liberals make towards Vladimir Putin and his irredentist tendencies, that it's not simply a matter of national security for him as far as like NATO involvement, but instead there's a ultra nationalist sentiment. Now, did he do that to capitulate once again to the further right wing elements in his country in order to make sure that he can in order to make sure that there is no there's no one outflanking him on the right? Or did he do that because he genuinely is a firm believer?
At the end remember when Putin first came into power, he was our liberal. And we were very excited.
He did mention all that. I loved it when he was like, okay, can I ask you a question? Do you feel like, I felt like that entire interview, Vladimir Putin, obviously he's not known for his honesty, but I felt like he was basically trying to be like, why won't you make me your Israel? Like, we're a bourgeois country. Like, we're not a communist country. Why can't we be your Israel? Is what it felt like he was saying that, or at least like in his development, like post dissolution, he positioned himself as though he was desperately not desperately, but like trying to make these attempts over and over again with American leadership.
Yeah, part of the problem here is that Putin is at the end of the day, at this point, he's not a communist, and he'll talk about the fall of the Soviet Union being the greatest disaster of 20th century, but not because of it represented the fall of communism. It was because it represented the end of Russian greatness, basically.
Yes. Oh, 100%. They don't. He's like ideologically, obviously, not aligned with communism whatsoever. And I think that like a lot of Russian boomers, like people here in the Western world, I think mistake that when they read into like what people say about like, oh, the USSR was great. Like when they hear like boomers say stuff like that, they mistake that for like genuine enthusiasm towards socialism. And maybe there is some, for social safety nets and whatnot, especially because of what came after immediately in the dissolution. But in many respects, it's more so about Russian empire, like not an empire, but like Russia being a global hegemonic power, the USSR being like a powerful nation, a regional leader that was like duking it out with America directly.
Yeah, there's an element of that too. I think that there's nostalgia for Russia's sort of being the other superpower in the world. And there really is a real nostalgia for just the age of social safety nets, and it was just a very different country. There's sort of too much to talk about there, but the point that I was getting at here is, at the end of the day, Putin is a sort of deeply pragmatic, cynical liberal, I think. People don't like to think about him that way, but this is like, that is sort of the core of who he is, in the sense that he can't talk about why the U.S. had this adversarial relationship with Russia after the Cold War, because that would mean that would be a big indictment of capitalism. The main offense that the U.S. committed towards Russia after the Cold War was not really the expansion of NATO. It was primarily vulture capitalism,
Yeah,
just picking that country apart.
absolutely.
And that just that brought life expectancy down. That just brought standards of living down. That
Prostitution skyrocketing,
yeah,
people committing suicide at a rapid clip.
that hurt the country so much. But the sort of one little interesting dynamic I think here is that Putin can't really talk about that aspect as much. So he has to come up with this sort of alternative narrative of why of this adversarial relationship with the US. He can't just articulate it in terms of competing business interests. So instead, what you get in that interview is just him sort of, acting baffled and being like, I don't understand it. Why couldn't they just cooperate with us? And it's like, well, they can't cooperate with you because they're an imperial power and you're an imperial power, and imperial powers don't cooperate, they compete. That's how it works. And he knows this. I wrote a piece about the interview afterwards, and there were a couple times when he alluded to sort of communist ideas about imperialism. It was very
Wait, can I ask you a
yeah,
question here?
yeah,
Would you
yeah.
say that there is like, I mean, this is a purely beneficial positioning for both Russian interests, from a capitalist sense, of course, from a liberal
Yeah.
sense, as you said. Because when you said liberal, people like lost their minds in the chat, but you mean liberal as like political theory and not liberalism as like
Yeah.
what we know libtards in America or whatever. Like,
Yeah, I should clarify that.
yeah,
I use liberal in the sort of old Marxist sense, and
yeah,
also in like the kind of international sense that's
yeah,
used to just mean aligned with capitalism. So I
yes.
don't mean it in the narrow sense of being aligned with the democratic agenda or stuff like that. I mean that he is, at the end of the day, he's a committed capitalist.
Yeah,
That's what I mean by liberal.
and the question I had was, would you say that it's like a mutually beneficial relationship to consistently have an antagonizing force in the West for Russia to build up its like military might once again, and use it, provide a revving engine for its economy in the same way that like America needs constant conflict because these defense contractors have to keep making weapons for something, and if there's global peace, that threatens the bottom line of the American defense industry, right? Which is like our most robust and most viable industry remaining.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's like it's beneficial to position Russia as still some communist like Red Scare propaganda induced foreign adversary, despite the fact that it has been led by, in air quotes, our guy
Yeah.
for damn near its entirety, and yet there's still like constant tension. So it's like dueling interests in the military industrial complex in either side of the
Yeah.
spectrum.
And I mean, like when were tensions eased most between Russia and the US? Well, it was when its economy started to, I don't want to use the word liberalize now, capitalize or whatever.
But
But
it
it
is
was
the
when,
correct term is liberalization
yeah,
of the
yeah,
markets.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was when the Russian economy was making that transition, opening it up to the West, getting McDonald's, and
Yeah.
Gorbachev is doing Pizza Hut commercials, and that kind of thing. Like it was when our business interests were aligned that our countries there was the most comedy. And what is a big part of what is happening now is that the top sectors of the Russian economy have consolidated their power enough and sort of become competitive enough on the world market, especially with energy, but also, like I said, its customs union that was trying to build is a big deal. It's become competitive enough on its own that a lot of Western business interests see it as a threat now instead of a business partner. So that's where a lot of the tension comes from. Is like we're seeing in Ukraine. Ukraine is very much just sort of. I always see it as a fight over which trade deal Ukraine was going to make. Was it going to make this trade deal with the EU, or was it going to make this trade deal with the customs union? Both of them were mutually exclusive. And Putin actually said in his interview with Tucker, he says, when we read through the Treaty of Association, it turned out to be a problem for us since we had a free trade zone and open custom borders with Ukraine, which under this association had to open its borders for Europe, which would have led to flooding of our market. He is explicitly saying there that they saw competition with the EU as a threat. And he was correct about that. It absolutely was a threat to Russian interests. Flooding Russia with cheap goods, its companies were not in a position to compete with that, would have devastated the Russian economy too. So it makes sense that he would take this protectionist position just for the sake of his own country. But, the problem on top of that is that he's also trying to monopolize Ukraine himself.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, we're in agreement there. So what does that mean for what the realistic scenario is for what it looks like for Russia in the next in the next decade or so, and what this means for Ukraine in the next decade or so?
Well, I think Russia's future is there are a lot of different things that could change. Like climate change is going to be a massive deal for Russia. How that ends up playing out, because you are looking at the thawing of millions of acres of Siberian land that suddenly becomes farmland. Stuff like that could just have a massive impact on Russia's economy. It is definitely it's increasingly shut off from anything associated with the West and Europe anymore. They don't have McDonald's anymore. They're going to be in this trade alliance with BRICS, which is, like four out of five of those nations don't even pretend to be socialist. China is at least nominally communist, but the other ones are not. And so
also they're in constant conflict with one another, but this is pure like pure trade relations is what you're referencing here. Like obviously,
yeah,
one of them is India.
They're gonna. There's going to be opportunities and sort of situations where they are able to sort of work together and leverage their collective economic power against the old US-EU alliance. And so I think that, but I don't think that will have the stabilizing effect that a lot of leftists do, because a lot of leftists seem to think that if you have this multipolar world, that everybody is going to stop fighting each other because everybody can defend themselves now. But what actually happens is the competition just ramps up, because everybody becomes increasingly capable of fighting and of acquisition and of extending and projecting their power. So in the case of Russia, as its economy develops, especially in its partnership with China, I don't. It's hard to say what's going to happen. I think that sort of after Ukraine, I don't really see any sort of logical expansion ambitions at this point for it. Ukraine and Georgia were always sort of the big bones of contention.
Well, it was an enforced red line, I guess. What do you say to like? I mean, this was my position. Maybe it's a totally incorrect read, but post 2008, on his way out, George W. Bush famously declared on his way out, great foreign policy guy. I mean, he He really did a phenomenal job across the board. That administration, oh my Lord, right? On his way out, he was like, now that I also fucked the situation with Palestinians further, and then try to do a failed coup, and then Hamas solidified its position in Gaza. Let's tackle the Russian NATO problem, where he famously said that he would bring in Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, and that we should start the conversation of bringing Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. This was obvious.
Senators pushed for that.
Which senators pushed for that?
Yeah,
No, I don't know.
John McCain and Hillary Clinton.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yes. Of course.
They were the two. There was actually a resolution towards offering a membership plan to those countries that McCain and Clinton co-sponsored,
Yeah.
and Obama signed on to it as well. So they were all there.
Yeah. So, I mean, the usual suspects. Exactly.
Yeah.
And then obviously, like, the special military operation, in air quotes, came shortly thereafter for Georgia, immediately creating like a territorial dispute and annexation, which rendered it impossible for Georgia to ever join NATO. But I don't even think that was ever a realistic outcome, regardless.
No.
Considering Georgia not having the same, like, even geopolitical justifications for NATO membership, in the same way that, like, I guess in the same way that, like, Turkey was brought in many years prior, obviously way before Russia even existed in the way that it does now. And then Ukraine being a continuation for this continuation of the same, like, false notion that that there would be some kind of NATO involvement in Ukraine as well. Do you feel as though, like, my assessment is that, like, this was, like, only partially for ensuring that there was never going to be any kind of there was never ever going to be a moment where Ukraine would join NATO from the Russian side, but it was also a miscalculation on Putin's on Putin's behalf, that, like, the operation failed, the war failed utterly and completely.
Well, I think it. I think it's is reasonable to say that like, Russia does have sort of legitimate national interest grounds for concern when NATO is supposedly breaking its obligations. I believe that old "not an inch to the east" story that always goes around. Breaking these informal promises and just pushing up against its borders and installing these missile bases and stuff. I think that any country is gonna be concerned about it. Doesn't mean that it's okay to invade. I think, I think that ultimately this has, in a lot of ways, well, I don't know. So the thing is, it did bring in these Nordic countries into NATO that were not in before. And that's a big L. For Putin.
I've brought this up quite a bit. It was like it was the greatest gift of all to give to, like, American generals and the American defense industry and all of the people that like wanted to reaffirm the necessity for NATO. Like, I see NATO as a protection racket, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a bad guy out there, right? Like, the mafia comes to your door and says, like, listen, your storefront could break down if you don't get this protection from us. But that doesn't mean that there isn't another competing group of criminals out there that could actually fuck up your storefront. And I think one of the worst things that could have happened was that it both showed that there is a necessity for NATO, right? Because Russia is engaging in expansion, right? Or is willing to engage in expansion through violent means, but also simultaneously showed that it would do it in a way that would make it impossible for them to engage with, like, Finland, for example. Because there's no way if they like, all of a sudden it was more of a, I'll go so far as to say, like a paper tiger situation, where where of course, if you're Finland, you're going to be like, well, now there's like, why wouldn't they join NATO?
I
One,
mean, I think
it offers a
yeah.
comfort, like offers a barrier protection. And Russia has, or Putin has definitely demonstrated that he's willing to do crazy things no matter what the cost is. But as Elent News in the chat says, it revitalized a reason for NATO to exist while simultaneously showing that there wasn't a genuine threat from Putin retaliating, because I think that retaliation threat is what kept the neutrality, not on paper, but like the neutrality that existed, the dual neutrality of Finland, Sweden, for not joining NATO. Because like you don't want them to potentially come in and invade your country, right?
Yeah, that's part. I mean, when people make that kind of argument about NATO, my response is always, what is the UN for? Like, if you have a country acting aggressively, that's what the UN is supposed to ostensibly be doing, is preventing this from happening, even stepping in with force if necessary. And they have deployed troops before. And there are obvious reasons why the UN has not intervened in this case. But those are, so we designed this anti-democratic security council, and we have Russia in it too. So of course Russia is going to be able to block initiatives like this. That's us getting hoisted by our own petard. But yeah, it's ridiculous. It's been very counterproductive for Putin in that sense, that he's given the Nordics an excuse to join, given the NATO people sort of an excuse to make that diplomatic push to bring them in, and made it politically possible, because you also had worried populations. They were stoking a lot of fear that Russia could invade, Finland or whatever, or Sweden. And, none of that was ever going to happen really, but you have this population that's getting worked up, and you have this U-turn in public opinion towards NATO that immediately followed that. So yeah, I think that is a L for Putin. On the other hand, Ukraine really has a lot of geostrategic importance for a lot of different reasons for Russia, just in terms of access to this Black Sea port that it's getting out of Crimea, and this land bridge it's built is a huge deal for it. Potential control of the farmland. Ukraine is still a major breadbasket of Europe. And just its positioning, sort of, it's hard to explain, but where Ukraine is located has always been a very vulnerable flank for Russia, and just gaining a little bit more control there makes Russia more easily defended. So Ukraine is a very high value get, and I don't know if having sort of a neutral but effectively incorporated into the EU Nordics, I don't know how much he lost there that he hadn't already effectively lost. The Nordics weren't going to be that useful allies to him in the future in major conflicts with the West. So from a strategic standpoint, I think it's a wash. I think that he's losing a lot there, but he's potentially gaining a lot, even by just carving off the east and southeast of Ukraine and getting that land bridge to Crimea. That's a huge deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I feel like we covered this up and down every way to Sunday at this point, and I don't want to take up more of your time. This was very valuable, and I will probably call upon you in the future as well. For things, for matters that pertain especially to this situation. But is there anything that you feel like you haven't? Is there anything that you feel like you haven't actually covered as far as like maybe something that you've seen of mine, like takes that you've seen from me that you think deserves like additional clarification, maybe something I got wrong like entirely. There's no like I'm not fearful of you saying like, oh, you're wrong here. Like don't hold back at all. If there's anything that you think like was like totally inconsiderate or completely off base,
Yeah.
you know,
No, everything I've seen from you has been basically okay, as far as I can tell. The only time I ever really find myself pushing back against the left is sometimes they really do end up talking about this war as if Russia had no choice but to invade because of NATO. And I haven't seen you make that mistake. And I think that's always a very silly argument. You know, people always do the Chomsky thing of saying, well, what if Russia built bases in Mexico? How would we react? And my response to that is, well, I would hope we wouldn't invade Mexico. You know, like that's not something that Putin had to do. And he proved that by not doing that for years and years on end.
Exactly.
So
I think that it's also because like I think he knows that Ukraine was not going to join NATO. Like even if there are other mechanisms of pressure that I always thought were way better. One of the greatest things you can do to neutralize this like genuine threat is by consistently continuing on beefing up your trade relations with Europe in a way that is like in a way that makes it infinitely more costly to actually engage in any kind of Cold War or even hot war as well. Like I always looked at China, I guess, as the other example. Like the relations that we have, the trade relations we have with China are so significant that disrupting all of that, I feel like would be horrible for our capital owners, like the capitalist class in the United States that deals with China quite a bit in manufacturing.
Yeah, there's a split on that. You have a lot of people who are very who are very hawkish and want a war to start. You also actually have, like you have the Quincy Institute is funded by Soros and the surviving cock. I can never remember which one it is. Is it Charles? I forget. Or
Yeah,
I think it's Charles Cock. Yeah.
Cock.
It's Coach Cock brothers. And it is like this is a anti-war institute that's actually been making arguments against war with China, and it's only able to do that because the people who fund it are paying for this. There is a real interest among some of the capital class in avoiding a war with them for, I think, precisely the reason you've given here, because it would be disruptive in a lot of ways. And there is but I don't think that lasts forever. I think that eventually sort of the nature of capitalism is to expand into, this is Lenin's theory of imperialism, where the nature of capitalism is to expand into a monopoly and try to monopolize more and more resources. And eventually you have to push beyond your borders to get this. And that is sort of the fate of US-Chinese relations, at least on our end. Certainly as long as we are this capitalist regime, it's just a matter of time. But the bourgeoisie is conflicted about this right now. Yes, I agree.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Carl. Where can people find you?
I am at carlbeijer.com. I got a Substack there, and it's free subscriptions, but I also have a paid tier. And I'm also on Twitter. Those are two main places that I hang out on. So my name is spelled strange. I guess Hasan probably has it in the chat right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are the two main places. So follow me on Twitter. Subscribe to the Substack. I talk about a lot of this stuff all the time.
All right. Thank you so much for coming on, Carl.
Thank you. Thank you. Great talking to you, Hasan.
All right. Have a good one.
Yep.
Okay. My Discord pooped while we were having this combo. So like, oh, it's fixed now. Okay, good. My Discord broke while we were having this convo, so I was like literally sitting there so worried. I hope that was a enlightening conversation for many of you. Obviously, these are more complicated than the way that you can it's no matter how you try to cover such a situation like this, it's always going to be reductive. The goal always, of course, is to try and inform the audience to the best of my ability. But I do hope that the people understand the nuances of the subject here. And this was a good week for political Andes. Mark Laurent Hill, now Carl Beijer. Yeah, I'll probably have more thinkers on this stuff as well. As far as the haters in the chat goes, I think one of the greatest things you can do in this situation like this is just like let them type it out, because at the end of the day, you mostly realize that it starts off with is this the invasion Hasan never said would happen, all the way to I'm actually trolling and I've ruffled methinks I've ruffled some feathers in the chat. That sort of thing. No, the classic, no, I wanted to poop my pants, and now everyone is saying that I smell like shit, but you're actually owned. Yeah. The Gerber method of dealing with a crying baby. Let them cry and cry and cry until they wear themselves out. So, overall, you need to yap less with your guest. No, I yapped a good amount because I want to also, I'm not under the assumption that my guest knows all my positions, okay? Like you do. Carl's one of those people like you that get both NAFO freaks and the DRPK flag emoji freaks mad at him. Good to hear from him. Yeah. I think Carl explained it well, more from a person who sees it through the Ukrainian and Russian lens rather than the American. Do you think the lead in the Stanleys is making white women even crazier? Maybe. Probably not.